Thanks so much, everybody, for joining our panel on sound design and mnemonics and valuation. My name is Stone. I'm the senior producer at Butter Music and Sound, and I'm also the West Coast chapter president of AMP. So AMP is the Association of Music Producers, and we're an advocacy association for creators of music and sound for media. So if you have any questions about our organization, you can always go to our website. And also you can feel free to email me with any questions you might have. But thank you for taking the time for being a part of this panel. We have 4 amazing panelists who are joining us today to talk about mnemonics and sound design as it pertains to sonic branding. I wanted to give just like a quick intro of what sonic branding is and what we're going to be talking about during the panel. Basically, the format is we'll hear from each of our panelists on the project that they've worked on in the past, talk about the process and the journey of like creating a sonic logo for different brands, basically the importance of this and what kind of work goes into the creation. So sonic branding, oftentimes when we're talking about sonic branding or sonic logos, we're talking about expressing your brand through sound. And one way to kind of like, I guess, put it for a sonic logo is you have these oftentimes like short forms of audio that express this logo through sound. Typically, these audio logos are 1 to 5 seconds long, and oftentimes they include mnemonics or sound design to help create these logos. And I feel like in the industry, we've seen a pretty sizable demand for sonic branding and sonic logos. Brands typically want an earworm, something memorable to help define their voice and act as a button for their various forms of advertising, whether it's TV, commercials, social media, spots, what have you. It has been estimated that companies recently are requesting more sonic logos in their creative work. There was one estimate that we had found that it stated that companies had increased their use of sonic logos about 3-fold in the past decade. Whether or not this is truly true, I would say I'm not too sure like the full credibility of the source. I think internally, if you talk with anybody who's in like the creative space, working with music for advertising, this seems to ring pretty true, just with the amount of clients that are asking for sonic logos for their brand. So I think with that in mind, we really want to talk about just the importance of this and the creation of these sonic logos. And so that's why we're here to talk about it today. A few other terms that I wanted to go over. I had mentioned mnemonics and sound design. Typically, these are the 2 building blocks to create a sonic logo to make sure everybody's on the same page. A mnemonic typically is a sound logo that's comprised of melodic patterns to help listeners remember a brand. So think like, the McDonald's, ba-da-ba-ba-ba, that would be a mnemonic. And then for sound design, oftentimes, this is just creating, recording, and editing various audio elements, whether it's ambiance, score, sound effects, to help craft a soundscape for media. And oftentimes it's layered with a mnemonic in the creation of a sonic logo. But how are these sonic logos created? That's something I want to leave to our experts to talk about. So if we can have our first panelist talk about just their experience with a campaign of their choice in the development of that campaign, the logo.
Yeah, I mean, I won't take up too much time. I think, I'm really excited about speaking to you, Stone. Thank you for organizing this and my esteemed colleagues here. We do a lot of sonic branding work. We've done work for CBS and Netflix. I wanted to talk about a project we had done for Instacart, which I think is a fun example of the type of branding project that we're really interested in here at Antfood, and I assume a lot of you all on the call and the rest of the panelists are as well. I mean, Stone, it's funny that you say like about the credibility of the source. I think we all anecdotally can say there's a lot more sonic branding work. We're also hearing it a lot more in terms of media. I always talk about how, music, sound design, audio, people can complain about budgets and whatever, but there's more money invested in all things audio than any other time in media history. It's just fragmented out in all of these different little ways, and sometimes there are different production companies, agencies, internal teams at brands that are working on all of the different work. So it kind of gets broken apart. One thing I find really exciting about sonic branding is when you are working with, a team internal that can be, all the way up to the CMO or the head of brand, or it can be some, teams that work in the marketing department. There's an opportunity to sculpt about how a brand is going to appear sonically across all of these different touch points. And you might have like different countries, different, like a tiny little production company that's, spitting out some social content here. Some agency of record is doing a big brand campaign. Some totally disconnected group is making the user experience for their mobile app, right? And so I think that's sort of the backdrop of, we had done a project for Instacart, which one of my great colleagues is on this call, who had helped out with this. And we had started with a sonic logo that, I think one of the themes of this conversation is, it's not just, let's throw some ideas here and record some sounds and mess around in Ableton and see what happens. I guarantee, like, we and anyone on this call, we can make a quality piece of sonic content that's memorable, that's repeatable, that's attributable. But what's really important is it needs to be unique and specific for that brand. It has to convey their essence, their brand principles or pillars or values or mission, or however we're going to define it. And so there's a lot of upfront work that we do, and I think everyone here does, in terms of discovery and research, in terms of building out and collaborating on a strategy, right? Sound is such a visceral, medium that, we can react to and like something or not. But it's only going to gain real value for a brand when it represents them in the eyes, hearts, minds, ears of their audience. And so with Instacart, we had started making a sonic mark, sonic logo, mnemonic, whatever we want to call it, that they'll slap at the end of, and the start also of advertising, marketing videos, even sort of internal comms type linear work. But that really expanded out into building a whole musical toolkit where we made all of these different tracks with variations and ability for them and their teams to use on everything from glossy big budget advertising to like an internal onboarding video or an explainer video for shoppers who are the people that, buy the groceries and then bring them to you. There's sort of two sides of Instacart app of how it reaches. And then that further turned into a UI UX exploration where we're taking the fabric or the sort of content of the sonic brand and applying it to all the little clicks and blips and bleeps and bloops as you use the app. They also have a like a smart what is it called? It's called the caper cart. It's like a smart shopping cart that you can like throw a bunch of lemons in and it'll count them for you, or it'll weigh things and check out that way. So that was a fun kind of sound design, in addition to the mobile app. But I'll pass on to the next person. But the TLDR for you, Stone, is that started with a sonic brand, made a ton of music that was on brand. We even made briefs and guidelines for other people to make music, and a lot of sonic elements for user experience. And in my mind, that's when what we do, like our craft and our expertise, can really make a difference to a client, because it's going to be at a level that's above all of the different disparate parties that are working on content, right? And that's a way that we can help Instacart unify their messaging, at least as it pertains to all things audio, from a brand perspective.
Totally. And I think like breaking that down of how that was applied in so many different ways, it does make me think of like, and this is my segue into Craig for your example of sort of like seizing the moment, especially culturally. Instacart, is taking that, this came at a good time when like obviously people were just ordering more food at home. I feel like with the campaign that you worked on with Hilton, that was also like a big kind of cultural moment, to me at least, in how that was rebranded. So I'd love to hear about how that campaign came about.
Hilton was super fun and interesting. It was a ton of research because, Hilton and many hospitality brands are not just like one brand. They often have several brands under their umbrella, and Hilton is no different. So do a lot of their competitors. So it was just a ton of kind of like listening for white space to figure out two things. First of all, where could Hilton stand out? But also Hilton was aiming to sort of reinvent how hospitality brands were advertised in general, because a lot of what you see is from like either Airbnb or Hyatt or whatever. It's almost like the hotel itself is, I should say the property, not just the hotel itself, is secondary. You know, it's like, oh, you're in Italy. It doesn't matter where you stay. You're going to go see the Colosseum and all these things in Rome. Whereas Hilton wanted to put the hotel and the property itself back at the center of it and remind people that when you're at one of Hilton's properties, everything's taken care of. They called it for the stay. So certainly we were looking for white space. That was one of the things we were looking for. And we actually realized in listening to, it wasn't like we were just listening to commercials. We were just listening to all of this music that and sound that these hotel and hospitality properties are putting out. And we actually like invented a term for the genre that they almost inevitably all default to, which is we called hotel chic, which is that just like real smooth kind of electro pulse sort of thing. So we knew really quickly what we didn't want to do, because doing that would just not differentiate Hilton at all from anything that anyone else was doing. By the way, including also what a lot of Hilton was doing before they kind of reinvented themselves. So it was pretty easy to define the white space. What was less easy was figuring out what that for the stay moment was going to sound like. And we talked about that feeling of when you walk into one of their properties and you've had 3 flight delays and you know your kids are yelling at you and like all of these things that many of us have experienced. And then when you walk into Hilton, it's just like a release, a breath of fresh air, that the doors open.
Hilton for the stay.
You know, we came up with the mnemonic, which is a pretty simple one. It is definitely a mnemonic. It's a simple melody played on a piano that feels very much like a landing and an arrival. It's voiced over by Catherine O'Hara, which is always, you know, fun to be involved in a project with her because she's so iconic. It became so successful for them so quickly that when you're sitting on hold for them and they finally pick up, they play the mnemonic for you, and then their customer service answers. So, you know, they're starting to branch that out into other things. And that was part of it as well, kind of, you know, where else can we use this? And that's another thing with sonic branding, you know, I'm specifically talking about a mnemonic, but Wilson touched on it as well, is that sound is so much more flexible than a lot of other media, because you can put it on the phone, you can put it on a podcast, you can put it in app and kind of like flex a sound so that maybe the visuals are pretty different, but the sound is similar or melody is similar. And it just gives you a lot of options when you come up with something strong and identifiable.
Absolutely. That's awesome to hear, like that they're kind of adapting it in more spaces. That's interesting to hear of like the research that kind of went into just getting like the hotel sound right, seeing like what is like familiar, then, you know, kind of like locking in on that sound. Again, I'm gonna like let this lead into my question and intro for Amy. I'm curious because I know you talked about wanting to, you know, discuss like your work with the NBA on ESPN, just like sound package, like what like research went into that and just how did that whole process go?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting that you ask about research first. I mean, there was no explicit research that was done as part of that project in particular. You know, the reason I wanted to bring this particular kind of case study to this discussion is it's like an interesting full circle moment where you kind of come back to the core of storytelling, right? In like film and media. And a lot of those ideas that came from film and film scoring, you know, the world building that a composer like John Williams does in the universe of Star Wars with themes and sub-themes, and how those approaches have inspired a lot of the way we approach sonic branding, right? Which is a lot of systems thinking. How do we build a sonic world around a brand that tells a story, makes an emotional connection with an audience, is memorable? We talk about creating things that are iconic, enduring, and then also effective, right? People remember it. It changes people's perceptions of the brand. It makes an emotional connection. And those are things that we do try to measure. You know, in the case of NBA on ESPN, we were kind of going back to a little bit of the origin story of that process in terms of really thinking about long form, you know, musical storytelling about the NBA and about the way ESPN tells those specific stories, like in their very specific, beautiful way. You know, we were thinking about primetime entertainment, culturally relevant, you know, global first name basis superstars, that red carpet walk that you see now happening more and more with folks coming out, and really just thinking about how to tell that story with sound. That was really like the basis of what we did. And then think about how you score those stories before you know what they're going to be. That's always a big thing that we've thought about too when we're thinking systems is, there could be a lot of different outcomes. There could be a lot of different touch points for a brand in the course of a game, in the course of a season. What are those things that we need to anticipate? We want to make sure that there's music and sound associated with each of those moments to really help reinforce and kind of bring the emotional impact of those moments home for folks. We created a core theme package for NBA on ESPN for the regular season with a lot of additional sort of cuts and sort of musical and genre variations to kind of score that full story, right? From tip off to halftime to overtime, those like buzzer beater game winner moments, a playoffs package, which sort of up leveled the sort of cinematic feel of that for those major playoff games and finals games to really get the audience amped. And then also in terms of coming back to that idea of systems thinking, having variations of that theme then also created and delivered for the broadcasts and even podcasts that kind of surround and package up all of this, like NBA Today, pre-show content, like in studio kind of talking head stuff, Stephen A. Smith, his own sort of take, with his persona, how does that kind of bridge with the sound of the broadcast, post-show analysis. And then we also had this kind of cool moment where we were rolling that music out the first week that it was on air, and Ty Dolla $ign and Mustard came into the studio at ESPN and kind of had busted out a couple drum machines and had sampled the theme and did a little remix on the fly on air, which was really cool, just as a way to kind of like reinforce the cultural credibility and the cultural resonance of what we had created, which was really, I think, at the heart of this assignment. That was really the goal in terms of changing the music for that broadcast and thinking about how to carry that into a next generation of viewers.
Totally. I know, like when I watch like the NBA, it always gets stuck in my head. And as you said, creating this world, like the sonic world to like step into, it's huge because now when anybody watches this, you don't even think about it, but you just see NBA on ESPN and you just know what it's going to sound like when Stephen A. Smith gets on the camera and it's like his own distinct version of it. Eric, I guess like when you're being a creative and a composer, how do you tap into the sonic world and like what goes into that as a writer? And like, any examples that you might have that kind of speak to how fun or daunting or scary that is.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny. It's so great to hear the other panelists talking about their experiences. They all just ring so true. We had worked on the NCAA basketball theme for ESPN as well. So hearing you talk about all that, it was just bringing back memories for me. But yeah, it is a daunting task. It is such a daunting task because it's a really large scale task that you're really trying to accomplish. I think that one of the things that we think about, and I'm sure our other panelists also think about, we're so often faced with clients that are really asset oriented. They're just after that mnemonic, right? One of the things that we often talk about with our clients is just, hey, first of all, audio branding isn't really just a music initiative. This is a branding initiative. This is something that's a reflection of the brand at large, not just a piece of music that should be catchy or should make you just feel something. It should target exactly what the brand message is and the brand personality is. And that sort of thing takes research. And it also, with respect to that mnemonic, which is probably the most valuable asset for the brand, it's really only the tip of the iceberg. We're not trying to sell a catchy 3-second piece of audio to a brand. We're trying to sell an entire set of guidelines on how they should be thinking about music and sound and how it can relate to their brand. And that mnemonic, a great example of this is when we did the Liberty Mutual mnemonic.
Liberty, 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 liberty.
This is a really great example because that process initially started as a typical music initiative where the client had engaged several different houses. They're demoing, they had hundreds of versions. I immediately was speaking to the client and was raising a hand and saying, hey, with all due respect, I don't think this is going to land you in the right place. You're not going to get a branded piece of audio. You may get something that's catchy and quality, but you're not going to land on that perfect brand fit. And they went through this process. They demoed several houses. They had hundreds of 3-second pieces of audio to choose from. They couldn't choose. Eventually, they picked something. They launched it. 3 months later, they came back to us and said, you know what? I think you're right. We're throwing that away. We want to start over. And they came back to us, and we finally engaged in that process with them, which involves a whole lot of competitive research, all the competitive space to understand the white space that we can create, that we can identify them and differentiate them as a brand, and just understanding the brand personality, the brand pillars. And all of this takes weeks. It takes a lot of manpower as well. And that's before any musician has even touched a key, Stone, just to talk about that daunting process, you can imagine, I'm sure my fellow panelists can relate. By the time you've finished that discovery phase, you've got this enormous monster of a brief. And that brief might be after just 4 seconds of music, or maybe a thematic, maybe an anthem and a mnemonic. But the first time I have to brief a composer who's never worked on audio branding, I send over that brief and I say, hey, you know what? Why don't you give me a call? We'll talk about this for a little while before you dive in, because so many of those inexperienced composers look at a 7-page brief with 20 different mood board examples and just feel lost on it. And it really just takes a little bit of experience with it, with that process, before you get comfortable with it as a writer and then can translate all of that information. I'd also say that there are those composers that will read every word of that brief and every asset that I send them. And then there are those composers that'll just kind of skip to some of the reference examples and get to writing. The writing process can work both ways. I've seen great work come out of both approaches, but doing what we do, I always appreciate those composers that are really ready and willing to dive into those deep the pool of assets, and really read that brief thoroughly and ask themselves a question, well, how do I create a piece of music that's really going to connect on all of these brand pillars, all of these brand personality traits?
Totally. Thank you so much for that answer, Eric. And I think what you said, thinking of audio branding not as a music initiative, but as a brand initiative, that's like a key term to convey. And I guess this is my question for all of you, like how do we best convey this to creatives at agencies, producers, without maybe scaring them because of all like the research that goes into this? But what is the best approach to explaining, hey, this is not your typical 30-second original composition. This is going to take a lot of work. What is your experience been in sort of conveying that to clients?
I'll just chime in here. I hope I'm not cutting in too soon here, but I would say, it is a really interesting challenge. I don't know if my fellow panelists can relate to me on this, but I find often my agency clients are a little harder to convince to think of this in broader terms than my direct-to-brand clients. Oftentimes, my direct-to-brand clients, when I just start talking brand with them, those clients are ready and willing to have that conversation. And a lot of times, the agency clients, there are many exceptions to this rule. There are plenty of really talented agency creatives that I work with that really do get it and want to dive deep. But a lot of times those agency clients need a little bit of convincing to really understand, hey, we're actually thinking of this the same way that you rebrand one of your clients. This process is so built on a branding process, not just a music creating process. That's usually where we start with that conversation.
Yeah, I'm happy to pile in on that comment, Eric. But yeah, I really appreciate that. I think to echo Eric, there are exceptions of the rule. We had done Citizens, which rebranded from Citizens Bank into Citizens. And that was through an agency, and it was a great experience. They're very smart people who understood the value of the process. Even large agency of records are typically going to oversee a fraction of the work of how this brand shows up in the world. And a sonic branding exercise should be, in an ideal world, it's not campaign specific, right? It's not vertical specific or media specific. It should embody the entire brand. If it's helpful, I think when these requests do come in from agencies, or they're sort of organizing the body of work, I often find that strategists and accounts people are really essential to that conversation. The creatives can bring some ideas and a spark to the conversation, but I think what we do in terms of the value that we can really provide is maybe a bit more closely tied to the marketing or the brand departments of the end client.
A lot of what we're talking about is education, and I think to really reinforce to clients that sonic identity or sonic branding should be considered core intellectual property for a brand. And there's a lot of value to that. The work that we've did for AT&T, we found that very quickly it became the second most recognized asset for the brand, that sonic logo that you heard in advertising, which was also in ringtones, also in sponsored spaces, also related to a retail, music strategy. But it was the second most recognized brand asset next to the globe visual for them. And most people, I guess in that research, believe that sonic logo had been around for 20 plus years when it had only been in market for 5 or something much, much shorter, right? So there is a lot to be able to show, especially when you are able to gather data and measure the impact and effectiveness of the work to point to that value. It's hard sometimes to say that sonic identity is going to lead to an increase in, say, consumer purchase intent, right? Or sales for cars increase because of the sonic logo. But we're always trying to find those ways to measure and show the effectiveness of these things, particularly if a client is willing to commit for the long haul, really thinking about these as enduring assets, not just thinking about it in terms of a campaign cycle or things that kind of come and go. And we really try to go through that education process. And then part of it for us is just saying, okay, does this feel like the right client to work with in terms of those shared values, in terms of understanding the value of the work that's being created and the purpose that's, behind it. Is a big part of kind of what gets us motivated to work on these things.
I think the one thing that I wanted to just piggyback on is about who you're talking to definitely matters. Motivations matter. And I think brand strategists, either on the agency side or on the brand side, are definitely good people to be talking to. Account people on the agency side, producers too, definitely creatives are certainly not to be left out at all, because ultimately you want them to be invested, because this is going to live on their work as well. So it should be something that everyone is invested in. And also, the creatives and our creative partners, the way that we're thinking about things at Human we want to make something that's good, in addition to making something that endures and all of this stuff. It's almost like if you make something that isn't good, it might endure for the wrong reasons. So, there is a taste level that needs to be considered. It should just be a holistic conversation. Strategists, producers, brand managers, agency creatives, marketing creatives, all of those people in the best case scenario are intimately involved in the project.
People are going to love things more if they each feel like they had ownership at some point in that process. Exactly. Otherwise, I think you can get into trouble trying to figure out, you hand something over and they're like, I don't like this, right?
Yeah.
Bring people into that process, right? Make that let people feel heard in that. I think that's really important to the success in the long run.
Yeah, we always say, like, with stakeholder interviews and talking to different departments and different people and agency partners, brand people, that like we want everybody at the end, whether they're popping in for a leadership review or they're in, a weekly stand-up meeting, we want everybody at the end of the process to feel like their fingerprints are on the work. I love this work because I love everything that people are saying, but it's like it's not just like I lock myself in the studio and make a track that is cool kind of thing. You're really playing a much deeper psychological, community, social kind of experience of bringing everybody to the table and pulling threads on the most interesting ideas and figuring out how we can leverage our craft and our expertise to bring that to life.
Yeah, we're meeting constantly with our partners. I mean, it's not like Wilson said, you're not going to give us a brief in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 5 weeks later, get several mnemonics back and pick one. Like, we're meeting the whole time. We're making sure that people are understanding why we're doing what we're doing. We're making sure that they're giving us feedback on the briefs that we're creating and all that, because like Amy said, it's all about getting everyone feeling like they have ownership over this, because we're making something great, we're making something for the brand, but it's got to have everybody involved.
That buy-in that you guys are talking about is really such an enormous part of the process of why we go through this extensive process. And I don't say buy-in just as a sell-through kind of thing. I'm talking about exactly what you guys are mentioning. It's about ownership, and it's about accounting for everybody's point of view, accounting for the strategist's point of view, and delivering on what every member of that team is looking to get out of this. And without that constant meeting and education, you just can't get that buy-in from the clients, and that's where these long-term projects can fail.
And I love what everybody said here, and I think I really appreciate that. It's kind of this theme of, it's not just like music creation, marketing is like a huge part of this, talking to accounts people, approaching this as like IP for the brand. And that kind of leads me to sort of deviate a little bit, but talking more about like the nitty gritty, especially as like we're creating these works. How do we approach, say, like if we are creating something that is like a sound design driven theme or logo, sound design, which I feel like is usually done, at like an hourly rate in a lot of instances when people think of sound design as like a sound design treatment. How do we broach those conversations of like, hey, we're creating sound design that is specific for this brand? And kind of tethering off of that, I'm curious, like when we are creating sound design based sonic logos or, assets, how do composers just receive like residuals for things like this?
How do we define sound design? Can I just ask that question?
I guess I would define it as maybe what it's not. Like, it's not just grabbing a sound and throwing it on there. Like, you go to a sound effects library and grabbing like a door knock and putting it on a door knock. It's thinking about like what goes into that door knock. What environment is it in? What are you, what type of door is it? Like, really crafting the thing that it is. Obviously, a door knock is not a brand asset, and that's kind of why I use it as a little bit more general. More specifically, if you're talking about a logo, it's, what color is this logo? What is this brand? What is, if there is animation, what's it doing? To me, it's creating sound, and it can be musical for sure. And that's where I think a lot of the gray area is, but creating something out of sound instead of music that speaks to what's going on with the brand and also on screen.
Well done, Craig. That's not an easy thing to define. I think you really did a nice job with that. I appreciate that.
Yes.
I would expand on this part of the conversation, because I think this is a challenge that we run into often. A lot of times, just the terminology here in audio branding can be tricky and can throw our clients. I've gotten that call a lot of times. Sometimes it's just like, hey, we need one of those end thingies, or sometimes I get a call from a client that just says, hey, you do sound design, right? Because I need one of those brand sound design things. And it's always an opportunity for education in that moment, because I think that a lot of our clients think of a logo as, oh, well, it's short, so it must be sound design, or So I don't know exactly what's going on and what led them to that point, but it's an opportunity to kind of talk it through. And I think oftentimes that term sound design just gets kind of confused with a sonic logo. It really is not. Sound design is an element that can be incorporated into a sonic logo. It could be only sound design for a sonic logo, or it could have no sound design at all. So it's just one of the tools in the toolkit to use when approaching an audio brand.
Yeah, I think in general, these are terms we try to avoid using and describing the work that we do in a sonic branding context, right? And some of that is, I think, to avoid this conversation, which is maybe a little bit kind of around the edges of like the commoditization of what that is, right? People might imagine sound design as drag and drop or whatever that is. Obviously sound design can be far more artful. I know, Wilson, you guys do a lot of stuff, it seems, with modular synthesis, right? That in itself is sound design, and that is an art, right? It's not meant to be demeaned or to say it's just a whoosh. So, I think that's, some of the other things that we kind of think about and still really try to treat, even in that short form moment. It could be 1 to 3 seconds, but we still kind of really like to hold that as miniature composition, right? There's still a lot of craft that goes into that, even if it is so concise in its final form.
Thanks, Amy. We're trying to sell our modular synth whooshes at a premium. But they are commoditized. There are these like famous graphics, and I might get the values wrong, but as you look at like the Nike swoosh and the Twitter bird, like the Twitter bird, Twitter was just a startup, nobody knew what it was, and I think somebody paid some designer who had Illustrator $35 to buy out the Twitter bird, right? So it was a $35 logo. British Petroleum, when they redid in that sort of fractally or like spirograph kind of looking thing, they spent $238 million making that logo, right? So there are few worlds. I'd say we all work in music too, right? On the panel and on, as most of the people I know on the who are the attendees, that's another wild world, right? Like we all know we can go find like a really shitty production music track in a library for $99 this afternoon. We could also get the Rolling Stones for $5 million. There's a huge range. And I think what's important to remember, and it's probably like a big red flag if you have a client that comes in and said, oh, but can we just pay you hourly to be like and then like we'll call it a day? I mean, that's not, even if it's the best possible, like it's not going to hold up as a brand element that's going to endure. Amy, I love what you said earlier. I feel like we all have similar processes and have a slightly different lexicon or vocabulary, how we present it to clients, but I love enduring. And so I think one thing that is hard for us as creatives, or maybe it's a little bit unnatural, but we're really charging for the process, right? We have this joke around Antfood that we have a big database of all the cutting room floor mnemonics that we've made, and thousands and thousands of little 1 to 5 second ditties, and some of them are very good, right? Some of them got developed and didn't make the cut at some point. Some of them were just quick little ideas that burst out. But our joke is that like they're good, and they're good to get a sense of direction, timbre, speed, pace, emotional valence. But they're not, none of those could ever like just be applied to another brand, because it's the process that's really valuable. It's, as Craig said, I think all of us said, it's about having those conversations. It's about the diligence of trying to figure out what are all of the sort of levers we can pull to convey this brand to a wider audience. Some of you know me, some of you don't, but like I'm a huge proponent against commoditization of anything that we do, and I fight for like the value and the creativity and the process. I love the rest of the panel to respond to this, but like I always joke, and in every joke there's some truth. I'd love a client to come to me, to our whole company, and say, we want you to figure this thing out. And we charge them a lot of money. We meet with them weekly for a whole year. And at the end of that year, we say, we think the answer is silence. We're not even necessarily delivering assets, but it's about the process of us as experts in this field about creating sound and understanding how other humans respond and react to sound, to giving them, the service is the journey. more than it is necessarily the end deliverable.
Yeah, I think if your client is a huge fan of Duchamp and John
Yeah.
Cage, you're gonna you're probably gonna be pretty successful with that.
The Cage music sound design approach. Yes.
I didn't want to leave the last thing unaddressed. What you asked about, like getting residuals. Yeah, the answer is to publish it as a piece of music, even if it's sound design, because like technically you can't really collect on sound design. So if you obviously any composer on here would have a publishing company or whatever that you're collecting through, you would have to publish it as a piece of music and fight that fight when it comes. But otherwise, like, straight sound design is not generally something that you can collect on.
I am curious, like this is kind of like more of a nitty-gritty question for composers who are on this call. What is the best way to publish it? Like with like their PRO. Just because I know Amy, you had mentioned, that oftentimes we're working in these short forms of audio. Some people in some companies believe that a 3-second form of audio is not a composition. What are the ways that we can work around that, or that composers can work around that?
I think what you're talking about is kind of quite a challenge in the world at large in music right now. I know that EMI is not collecting on works under 7 seconds, which is obviously quite a challenge in this business because the most used assets that we create are generally under 7 seconds. So it is something to be thoughtful about when a new composer is starting out, and looking to get into this type of work. ASCAP will collect on those short form pieces of music, whereas BMI won't. It is worth being thoughtful. I know that some BMI composers are finding some ways to register those works, sort of the longer formed versions of those works. And I think to some degree of success, they've managed to collect on those. But it is a little bit of a challenge, I think. I think that the world of music rights and collection hasn't quite caught up to where we're at currently with the world of audio branding, and it'll probably take a little bit of advocacy on all of our parts to really get it there.
Yeah. I also think it's important to just, and again, this is Wilson kind of looping back to something you said, which is around just really the value of the systems thinking, the approach, the process, the methodology, like the way we're trying to look at these things holistically. I can think of a lot of places sonic branding shows up that is not going to end up on a cue sheet, right? Or is like way off of the radar of PRO at this point in time, right? Like user interface sounds, the sound of a electric vehicle or another product, and all these other places that, sonic branding is very relevant and can impact audiences on an everyday basis. So I think that's just like the other thing to keep in mind. I think, in this conversation, I think this is a very important conversation. Also, sonic branding makes an impact in so many other places. And I think that's been like, a real challenge, right, as creators, to think about how do you value that for yourself, where again, if you're wanting something to be enduring, to really like reach an iconic status, in the world and in culture, think of all the places it could show up now. And as technology continues to evolve, right, and our experiences continue to evolve, where else could those things be showing up, down the line? That I think is like something that really contributes to just sort of even thinking about the value of the process, right? And the creators, Picasso doodles something on a napkin. The person next to him at the bar says, "Oh, can I have this?" And he says, "No, $5 million or whatever." And you're just like, it took you 2 seconds to do that. And you'd be like, no, right? That took a lifetime, to be able to know how to create something, that remarkable in that short a period of time.
Well, Amy, first of all, I love everything that you said. I love the Picasso metaphor, because I think a lot of the time, the final Sonic, it could have been made in an afternoon. It could have been made in 2 minutes. Maybe you just put a mic up and whistled and that's it.
First thing you tried before the 500 other things.
Yeah. But that's not where the value comes in. In looking at some of the questions about pricing model, we typically do project based. We have one client where we did a project based, and then that sort of evolved into a retainer, which is more kind of service based. But I personally would strongly recommend against hourly rate or cost plus, but everybody can do their own thing. And I know we're talking about PROs and residuals, royalties. This is hard, important, valuable work. If it's project based, should be charging a lot for it, right? It is a, we fight in this battle every day, and we can never charge quite as much as we think we're worth. And I think everybody understands the reality of it, but the baseline should be very high because it's hard, it takes time, it takes resources, it takes a lot of people, a lot of intelligent, brains that have trained their entire career for this. Maybe not, we're not on the Picasso level, Amy, but we've all worked really hard to get, to get to this point, and we have a unique skill set.
I'm trying to get both sides of that because honestly, it is a piece of creative that we've made, and tradition begets that there is going to be collection on that is earned. As far as, pricing, the one thing I wanted to piggyback on, Wilson, is where you said to charge a lot. And it's not just that there's all this work that goes into it, because, all of us have worked on traditional underscore work, I'm sure, that has taken 3-4 months. That's not terribly uncommon. It's not that common, but it is not terribly uncommon. But it's also the value that the brand is getting from this asset or these assets. I mean, if you're talking about a mnemonic, as this panel is focused on, it's going to ostensibly be on everything. If you were to license a piece of music and put it on everything, and you were paying a drop fee every single time, the cost would be exponential. It would be crazy. So it's both things. It's both that you are taking the time to make this, but then also the fact that the client is getting value out of this is also a pretty major component of it.
Yeah, speaking to the value, I mean, I would raise this to the rest of my fellow panelists here. Like, in my humble opinion, that audio logo is in so many ways a more valuable tool than a visual logo. It can live in so many more places. The research shows that the audio logo is far more memorable than a visual logo. If you ask somebody to sing back the "We Are Farmers" logo, I mean, every American would sing that back right away. But if you ask them to all draw the farmers logo, I think you'd come back with a whole lot of variation there. So I guess what I'm getting at is it has always struck me as sort of a frustrating thing. These audio logos we're constantly fighting for the value of them, and yet the value in the real world is so apparent. What Coca-Cola would pay for a visual logo is exponentially more than what they would pay for an audio logo. I don't know really exactly where that all comes from, but it's just always struck me as a contradiction that's rather frustrating in our industry.
I think it's having the data. I mean, that's when we started our Sonic Pulse research. That offering, was in part to show the value of the work that was being created, right? This asset or this suite of assets or this system can increase emotional appeal with the people that you're trying to reach. It's going to increase your brand recall. It's going to move those metrics that really matter to brand managers and to CMOs and chief brand officers and, CEOs. That's been a big part of, what we've been trying to do to kind of prove the efficacy of this work. Which is obviously there's much more data. Stone, I think you started with data, right? People are collecting much more information, in the audio space now than I think ever before, which is positive because people are talking about it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and it seems like everybody's just kind of like fighting for their own voice now. I mean, there's so many more formats to basically put advertisements on this space, and you're just fighting to fit in and also stand out. And audio is a huge way of how that kind of falls into our public consciousness. I just wanted to thank our panelists so much for being a part of this. And thank you for the time. This was very fun and very informative for me. That was why I was excited to kind of host this, because I knew I was going to learn a lot, and I certainly have. It was just wonderful to hear from each of y'all's perspectives on this. Thank you again so much for the time. Amy, Craig, Eric, Wilson, you all are legends. So thank you so much for being a part of this.
Thanks, Stone.
Cool. Yeah.
Thanks
so much. Yeah. Appreciate it. I'm sure we'll talk soon.